"You're lying." Mike's voice rang out across the courtroom, trembling with anger. Every eye turned to the boy sitting at the defendant's table, his fists clenched on the polished wood. For a moment, the room fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the shuffle of papers and muffled whispers. The judge banged his gavel, but the damage was done. Mike's outburst was a cry of truth in a place that seemed unwilling to hear it. The courtroom in the small southern town of Stonebridge was packed to capacity. Tension filled the air like a thick fog, leaving people shifting in their seats and exchanging wary glances. Outside, protesters chanted, their voices filtering in through the stained glass windows. Some held signs that read "Justice for Mike," while others demanded a harsh sentence for what they called a senseless crime. Mike, just 16 years old, sat in his oversized chair wearing a cheap suit that hung loose on his slender frame. His eyes, dark and defiant, darted around the room, taking in the faces of strangers judging him. In their stares, he could feel their verdict: guilty. He was accused of assaulting Peter Halliday, the son of Judge Edward Halliday, who just so happened to be presiding over the case. The story the prosecution spun was airtight, or so it seemed. Witnesses claimed they saw Mike near the scene. Bruises on Peter's face told a convincing tale, and a bloodied baseball bat was found near Mike's neighborhood. It didn't matter that none of the evidence added up, or that Mike had an alibi. In Stonebridge, a young black boy standing trial against the son of a powerful judge wasn't given the benefit of the doubt. But Mike wasn't about to go down quietly. "Young man, if you speak out of turn again, you'll be held in contempt," Judge Halliday warned, glaring down from his high seat. His voice was calm, but the menace behind his words was unmistakable. Mike glared back, unblinking. His mother, Lisa, squeezed his hand under the table, a silent plea for him to hold his tongue. She knew the stakes were too high to risk provoking the judge further. Lisa had spent her life protecting her son from the harsh realities of their town, but this fight was unlike any she had faced before. The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man with a condescending air, stood up and delivered another damning argument. He painted Mike as a troubled boy with a short temper and a history of petty offenses. "It's clear," he said, pacing in front of the jury, "that this young man had a motive. He resented Peter Halliday's success, his privilege. Jealousy breeds violence, ladies and gentlemen, and today we see its result." The words cut deeper than they should have, and Mike's mother flinched, but Mike didn't break eye contact with the jury. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him afraid. What no one in the courtroom knew, what would turn the entire trial on its head, was a secret Lisa had uncovered just days before. Hidden in plain sight, it was the kind of truth that could unravel the carefully constructed lies keeping Stonebridge in check. She hadn't yet decided whether to reveal it. To do so might save her son, but it would come at a dangerous cost. As the trial dragged on, Mike's lawyer struggled to present a defense against the overwhelming odds. Lisa sat quietly, her heart pounding with every passing moment. She knew the time to act was coming. Outside, the chants of the protesters grew louder, more desperate. Stonebridge was a town standing on the edge of something much bigger than a single trial. Mike, however, wasn't focused on the crowd or the evidence. His mind was consumed by one thought: Judge Halliday. There was something in the judge's eyes when he looked at Mike. A flicker of hesitation, perhaps even guilt. It was faint but unmistakable, and Mike couldn't shake the feeling that the man who held his fate wasn't as untouchable as he appeared. And when Mike finally smiled at the judge, it would be more than defiance. It would be a reckoning. "This isn't justice," Mike's lawyer muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible over the prosecutor's confident closing remarks. Yet, even as he said it, the courtroom felt like it had already made up its mind. To the jury, Mike was just another face in the system, a convenient target for their biases, a boy whose innocence didn't matter as much as keeping things simple. The prosecutor, Mr. Cross, was as methodical as he was ruthless. Every sentence he spoke was aimed to crush Mike's credibility, painting him as a troubled boy from the wrong side of town. He leaned on the jury's unspoken prejudices, weaponizing every stereotype he could muster. "Ladies and gentlemen," he declared, pointing at Mike, "what we have here is a young man who's always been on the edge of trouble. This crime is simply the culmination of years of poor choices." Mike clenched his fists under the table, his knuckles white as he listened. The words stung not because they were true, but because they weren't. His so-called poor choices were nothing more than petty accusations. Being too loud on a street corner, running in a park where he wasn't supposed to be, looking out of place in a grocery store. These moments weren't criminal. They were survival in Stonebridge. His lawyer, Greg Turner, stood up, visibly nervous but determined. Greg was new to the public defender's office, and this was his first high-profile case. He was young, idealistic, and utterly out of his depth against Cross. But he had one thing on his side: the truth. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Greg began, his voice firm but lacking the polish of Cross's performance. "The prosecution wants you to believe that Mike is a dangerous individual. But let's examine the facts." He walked over to the evidence table and picked up the bloodied baseball bat. This bat, which the prosecution claims links Mike to the crime, has no fingerprints. None. Not Mike's. Not anyone's. The only thing tying this bat to the case is that it was found near his neighborhood. That's it. Greg turned to the jury, his gaze steady. Is that justice? Is that enough to condemn a boy's entire life? For a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed the faces of a few jurors. But Greg knew he was fighting more than evidence. He was fighting years of systemic bias, fear, and preconceived notions about boys like Mike. As Greg continued, Lisa watched from her seat, her heart heavy. She had spent sleepless nights poring over the details of the case, desperately trying to find the crack in the prosecution's story. And she had found it, buried deep in the official police report. A discrepancy in the timeline. The assault on Peter Halliday was said to have occurred at 9:15 p.m., but a neighbor's security camera captured Mike walking into his apartment building at 9:10 p.m. He had an airtight alibi, except the footage had conveniently disappeared after being handed over to the police. Lisa had confronted the officer who took the footage, a man with a reputation for bending the rules. He had brushed her off with a dismissive shrug, but Lisa wasn't easily deterred. She had kept a backup copy of the footage, a decision that could either save her son or put her family in grave danger. As the trial progressed, it became clear that more than Mike's freedom was at stake. There were whispers around town about the Halliday family, about Peter's reputation as a troublemaker who often used his father's influence to escape consequences. Some even said that Peter's injuries weren't from Mike at all, but from someone much closer to him. But none of that made it into the courtroom. Judge Halliday controlled the flow of evidence with an iron fist, dismissing anything that even remotely suggested his son wasn't the victim. The courtroom wasn't just stacked against Mike. It was rigged. By the end of the day, Greg's voice was hoarse, and Mike felt the weight of the world pressing down on his chest. As they left the courtroom, protesters surrounded them, shouting and waving signs. Some called for Mike's release, while others demanded harsher punishment. Through it all, Mike remained silent, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with determination. Lisa placed a protective arm around her son, whispering, "We'll get through this. I promise." But even as she said it, she knew the odds were against them. The truth wasn't enough in Stonebridge. Not yet. The only question was whether she had the courage to reveal what she knew, and whether it would be enough to tear down the lies holding the case together. Lisa clutched her bag tightly, her fingers brushing against the USB drive hidden inside. The weight of it felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried. It wasn't just evidence. It was the lifeline that could save her son's future. But as she stared out the courthouse window at the crowd of angry protesters, she realized it was also a match that could ignite the entire town. The kitchen table at Lisa's small apartment was cluttered with old case files, receipts, and a laptop covered in fingerprints. She had spent the better part of 2 weeks poring over every detail of the prosecution's case, dissecting it piece by piece, desperate to find the flaw no one else could see. Her back ached from hours hunched over the table, and her eyes burned from sleepless nights. But Lisa couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Mike's face haunted her. He had always been her pride, her reason to fight harder. Even as a boy, he'd had this stubborn determination, this way of standing tall in the face of people who wanted to knock him down. She saw it in him now, but it scared her. The way he stared down the judge in court, the defiance in his eyes, it was the same fire that had kept him alive, but it was also the same fire that could make him a target. That morning, Lisa had taken a risk she wasn't sure she could undo. She'd called a local journalist, someone she knew from church who had been quietly investigating the Halliday family for years. The journalist, a woman named Camille Dawson, was one of the few people in Stonebridge brave enough to challenge the town's most powerful families. When Lisa handed her the USB drive, Camille's eyes widened. This could blow the case wide open, Camille had whispered, flipping through the footage on her laptop. But it's dangerous, Lisa. If the wrong people find out you have this. Lisa didn't need her to finish the sentence. She already knew the risks, but she also knew the truth couldn't stay buried forever. Now, sitting at the kitchen table, Lisa replayed the security footage on her own laptop, watching the timestamp, 9:10 p.m. It showed Mike stepping into their building, pausing to talk to their neighbor, Mrs. Howard, who always sat in the lobby at night knitting scarves. It was irrefutable proof that Mike couldn't have been at the scene of the crime at 9:15 p.m. like the prosecution claimed. And yet, the original footage submitted to the police had mysteriously gone missing. Lisa knew exactly who was behind it. Officer Donnelly, the cop who had taken the evidence into custody. He was known around town for his shady dealings, and she had overheard enough conversations in the past to know he was deep in Judge Halliday's pocket. Lisa's heart pounded as she thought about what she'd done. Giving the footage to Camille meant taking the case into the public eye in a way the courtroom wouldn't allow. It also meant exposing herself and Mike to even more danger. The Hallidays weren't the kind of family to let something like this go. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. For a moment, Lisa froze. She hadn't been expecting anyone, and a cold chill ran down her spine. "Mom? You okay?" Mike's voice came from the hallway. He had just come home from a grueling day in court, his face pale with exhaustion. "I'm fine, baby," Lisa said, quickly closing the laptop and stuffing the USB drive back into her bag. She forced a smile as she stood up, brushing the worry from her face. But Mike wasn't convinced. He looked at her with the same sharp eyes that always saw through her. "You found something, didn't you?" he asked. Lisa hesitated, torn between protecting her son and trusting him. "I found proof," she finally admitted. "Proof you weren't there. But Mike, this isn't just about you anymore. If I use this, it's going to make things messy, dangerous." Mike stepped closer, his voice steady. "Then we make it messy. They already think I'm guilty, Mom. What more can they do to us?" Lisa stared at her son, her heart breaking at the weight he was forced to carry. He was still just a boy, but in this moment he seemed older than his years. "We'll fight this together," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "But we have to be smart. This town, it doesn't like the truth, Mike. It's going to fight back." As she hugged him, her mind raced. She needed to plan her next move carefully. Camille had promised to release the footage at the right time, but Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that the Hallidays, or worse, the police, would come after them before that moment arrived. For now, though, she let herself breathe. She held her son tightly, whispering a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "We'll make it through this." But deep down, Lisa knew the storm was just beginning. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty when Lisa spotted him. Officer Donnelly leaned against his squad car, his face lit by the glow of a cigarette. He exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes darting around like a man with something to hide. Lisa tightened her grip on her car keys, her chest pounding with both fear and determination. If she was going to save Mike, she needed answers, and Donnelly was the weakest link. Stonebridge's police force was as corrupt as its courtrooms. Lisa had grown up hearing the stories, how evidence conveniently disappeared, how witnesses suddenly changed their testimonies, and how certain families, like the Hallidays, always seemed to stay above the law. Donnelly, with his sloppy habits and loose lips, was a small but critical piece in their system of control. Lisa's hands trembled as she stepped out of her car, but she forced herself to steady them. She wasn't just a mother tonight. She was a fighter. "Evening, Officer Donnelly," Lisa called, her voice calm but laced with steel. Donnelly flinched, startled by her sudden appearance. He quickly crushed his cigarette under his boot, trying to mask his surprise. "Lisa," he said, his tone guarded. "Didn't expect to see you here this late. What can I do for you?" Lisa didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know what you did with the footage," she said, her words cutting through the humid night air. Donnelly's face twitched. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Lisa shot back, stepping closer. Her voice was low but firm, the kind of tone that demanded attention. "You took the security footage that proved my son was innocent. You handed it over and somehow it vanished. I know you're working for the Hallidays, Donnelly. You don't have to admit it. I can see it in your face." For a moment, Donnelly said nothing. He glanced around the lot, as if making sure they were alone. Then he gave a low, bitter laugh. "You think you're the first person to stand here and accuse me of something? Lady, you're out of your depth." Lisa didn't flinch. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "And I'm not afraid of the Hallidays. But you should be afraid of what happens if this all comes out. Because I have the footage. The real footage. And when it gets released, everyone's going to know what kind of man you really are." Donnelly's smirk faded. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "If you had it, you wouldn't be standing here threatening me. You'd be sitting at home praying the Hallidays don't come after you. You don't know what you're dealing with." Lisa felt the weight of his words, but she refused to back down. "You're right. I don't know how far they're willing to go. But I do know this. You've spent your whole career covering for people like them. And when this falls apart, they're not going to protect you. They'll throw you under the bus without a second thought." Donnelly's jaw tightened. For the first time, Lisa saw something crack in his bravado, fear. He wasn't as untouchable as he pretended to be. Think about it, Donnelly, she pressed. You're a small-town cop. They're a powerful family. When the truth comes out, who do you think the world's going to blame? Them? Or you? The silence stretched between them, heavy and electric. Finally, Donnelly let out a sharp breath. You don't get it, do you? The Hallidays don't lose. Not in this town. Not anywhere. You think you're helping your son, but you're just painting a target on his back. And yours. Lisa held his gaze, her heart racing. That's my risk to take. Now, you have a choice, officer. You can keep covering for them and go down with them. Or you can do the right thing, for once in your life. Donnelly stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't mean much around here. Without another word, he climbed into his car and drove off, leaving Lisa standing alone in the lot. She watched his taillights disappear into the night, her mind spinning. Her confrontation with Donnelly hadn't gone as planned, but it wasn't a total loss. She had seen the fear in his eyes, the cracks in his armor. He was a weak link, and she wasn't done with him yet. As Lisa drove home, her thoughts turned to Mike. He had no idea how dangerous this fight was becoming, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it from him. But one thing was clear. The Hallidays weren't just trying to protect Peter. They were hiding something bigger, something that went beyond Mike's trial. And Lisa was determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. Mike's heart pounded as he rose from his chair. The weight of the courtroom's collective gaze pressed down on him, but he stood tall. His lawyer had begged him to stay quiet, to let the system play its course. But Mike knew better. The system wasn't going to save him. If he wanted to be heard, he had to speak now, even if it cost him everything. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Mike's steady footsteps as he approached the witness stand. Judge Halliday watched him with an icy gaze, his expression betraying nothing. To the judge, this trial was a formality, a performance designed to give the appearance of justice. But Mike saw the cracks beneath the surface, the tension in the judge's jaw, the way he avoided eye contact. Lisa sat in the gallery, clutching her purse as if her life depended on it. The USB drive was still hidden inside, but Camille, the journalist, had promised to release the footage that evening. Lisa had tried to convince herself that waiting was the right decision. But now, as she watched her son step into the lion's den, she wasn't so sure. Greg, Mike's lawyer, shot him a panicked look as he stood at the podium. Mike, he whispered harshly. This wasn't part of the plan. Mike ignored him. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I want to say something, he began, looking directly at the jury. I've been sitting here for days, listening to people tell stories about me that aren't true. I've been called a criminal, a liar, a bad kid. But nobody's asked me who I really am. The prosecutor, Mr. Cross, scoffed and began to rise from his seat. But Judge Halliday raised a hand, motioning for him to sit down. Proceed, the judge said, his tone carefully neutral. Mike took a deep breath. I didn't hurt Peter Halliday, he said, his voice firm. I wasn't even there. But none of you want to believe that because it's easier to see me as guilty. It's easier to look at me and think I'm the kind of person who would do something like this. He turned to the jury, his eyes locking on each member. But I'm not. I'm not what this town wants to believe I am. I work hard in school. I take care of my mom. I've never hurt anyone in my life. And the people who know me, really know me, they'll tell you the same thing. In the back of the courtroom, Lisa felt tears welling up in her eyes. She had always known Mike was strong, but seeing him stand up for himself in the face of such overwhelming odds filled her with both pride and heartbreak. Mike continued, his voice growing stronger. This trial isn't about the truth. It's about power. It's about protecting people like Peter Halliday and his family, no matter what they've done. And it's about punishing people like me for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The room was so quiet that Mike could hear his own heartbeat. Even Judge Halliday seemed taken aback by the boy's boldness. I'm not asking for your pity, Mike said, his voice breaking slightly. I'm asking for you to look at the evidence. The real evidence. Not the lies they've told you. Because if you do, you'll see I'm not guilty. When Mike finally sat down, the courtroom erupted into a flurry of whispers. Greg looked at him in disbelief, but there was a flicker of admiration in his eyes. The prosecutor quickly rose to his feet, his voice sharp. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defendant's testimony should have been reviewed with counsel before being presented to the court. Judge Halliday tapped his gavel lightly, silencing the room. The boy has spoken, he said, his voice cool. Let's proceed. But something in the judge's expression had changed. His usually stoic face looked strained, almost uncomfortable. Mike's words had struck a nerve, and it wasn't hard to see why. The trial had been orchestrated to ensure Mike's conviction. But now, with the boy's testimony echoing in the room, the cracks in the prosecution's case were starting to show. As the court recessed for the day, Lisa hurried to Mike's side, pulling him into a tight embrace. "You were brave today," she whispered, her voice trembling. Mike shook his head. "I don't know if it'll make a difference, Mom. They've already made up their minds." Lisa cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "We're not done yet," she said firmly. "There's something coming, Mike. Something that's going to change everything." She didn't explain, but Mike could see the determination in her eyes. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope. As they left the courthouse, Lisa felt her phone buzz in her pocket. It was a text from Camille. "The footage is going live tonight. Be ready." Lisa's stomach churned. The moment of truth was finally here, but she had no idea what kind of storm it would unleash. The courtroom was electric, humming with tension so thick it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. As the trial resumed, all eyes turned to Mike, but his gaze was fixed on one person, Judge Halliday. There was no fear in his expression, only an unsettling calm, as though he already knew something the rest of the room didn't. Lisa sat on the edge of her seat, her hands gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She could barely hear the prosecutor's arguments over the pounding of her heart. The footage had gone live overnight, and Camille's exposé had spread like wildfire. By morning, Stonebridge was buzzing with whispers and outrage. The footage showed what Lisa had known all along. Mike entering his apartment building at 9:10 p.m., pausing to speak to Mrs. Howard in the lobby. The timestamp proved he couldn't have been at the scene of the crime when Peter Halliday was attacked. Alongside the video, Camille had published a damning article outlining the Halliday family's history of corruption, their manipulation of the police, and their pattern of using power to bury inconvenient truths. By the time court was called into session, the Halliday family's pristine reputation was hanging by a thread. Judge Halliday looked more tired than usual, his face drawn and pale. He sat rigidly at the bench, his hands gripping his gavel as though it were the only thing tethering him to control. "Your Honor," Greg said, rising from his seat with newfound confidence. "Before we proceed, I'd like to submit new evidence to the court." The prosecutor, Mr. Cross, shot to his feet, his face flushed with anger. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The defense cannot introduce evidence at this stage of the trial without proper notice." Judge Halliday's jaw tightened. "Sit down, Mr. Cross," he said quietly. The prosecutor hesitated but complied, muttering under his breath as he sank back into his chair. Greg handed a USB drive to the bailiff, who inserted it into a laptop connected to the courtroom's projector. The screen flickered to life, displaying the grainy but unmistakable footage of Mike entering the apartment building. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs as the timestamp appeared on the screen, proving that the prosecution's timeline was impossible. "This footage," Greg said, addressing the jury, "was submitted to the police the night of the incident, yet somehow it disappeared from the case file. We now know that Officer Donnelly, the officer in charge of the evidence, failed to preserve it. I think we can all guess why." The murmurs grew louder, and Judge Halliday banged his gavel to restore order. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it. Quiet in the courtroom, Greg turned to the jury. "This footage proves that Mike couldn't have committed the crime. But more importantly, it raises a question. Why was it hidden? What is this court trying to protect?" The prosecutor attempted to object, but his words were drowned out by the buzz of the room. For the first time, the jury looked uncertain, their previous certainty about Mike's guilt now shaken. Mike sat silently, his expression unreadable. But then, as the attention of the room shifted back to him, he did something no one expected. He smiled. It wasn't a smirk or a grin of defiance. It was a quiet, knowing smile, the kind of smile that made people uncomfortable because it suggested he knew something they didn't. His eyes locked on Judge Halliday, who froze under his gaze. The judge's hands tightened on the gavel, his knuckles going white. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to speak. Finally, Judge Halliday cleared his throat. "The court will take a recess to review this evidence," he said, his voice strained. Greg opened his mouth to protest, but Mike placed a hand on his arm, stopping him. "It's okay," Mike said softly. As the judge stood to leave, Mike spoke again, his voice carrying across the room. "You know I didn't do it, don't you?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Halliday paused mid-step, his back to the courtroom. He didn't turn around, but his hesitation was enough to send a ripple through the room. Lisa's heart raced. She recognized that moment for what it was. A crack in the armor, a sign that the truth was finally pushing through. As the judge exited, the whispers began again, louder this time, filled with questions and accusations. Lisa reached for Mike's hand, squeezing it tightly. "You did it," she whispered. "You made them see." Mike shook his head. "Not yet," he said, "but he's scared. That's enough for now." The trial wasn't over, but the tide had shifted. The truth was out in the open, and the Hallidays could no longer control the narrative. What remained was the question of how far they were willing to go to protect their power, and whether Mike and Lisa could withstand the storm that was coming. Judge Halliday sat in his chambers, the heavy oak door locked behind him. His gavel lay discarded on the desk, his head buried in his hands. The calm, authoritative facade he wore in the courtroom had crumbled, leaving behind a man consumed by fear and guilt. The boy's smile haunted him, that quiet defiance cutting through years of control and manipulation. For the first time in his career, Judge Halliday felt powerless. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial resumed after recess. The jury returned to their seats, their expressions uncertain, a stark contrast to the confidence they'd carried at the start of the trial. Lisa could feel the shift in the air, her instincts screaming that something was about to give. Mike sat beside her, his expression calm but watchful, like a predator waiting for its moment to strike. Greg rose from his seat, his tone sharper now. The release of the footage had emboldened him, giving him the ammunition he needed to challenge the system head-on. "Your Honor," he began, "in light of the new evidence presented to this court, I move to have this case dismissed immediately." The prosecutor, Mr. Cross, stood up just as quickly, his voice brimming with desperation. "Objection, Your Honor. This footage has not been authenticated. The defense is attempting to derail this trial with baseless accusations." Judge Halliday's eyes darted between the two lawyers. For a moment, his mask of control faltered, and Lisa saw it. The crack in his composure. She didn't need to be a lawyer to understand what was happening. The judge was unraveling. "Your Honor," Greg pressed, ignoring the prosecutor's objection. "We all know why the prosecution is panicking. The evidence speaks for itself. The footage is genuine, and its disappearance from the police files wasn't an accident. It was sabotage." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Judge Halliday raised his gavel to quiet the room, but his hand trembled as he brought it down. "Enough," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clearing his throat, he repeated himself, louder this time. "Enough." Greg wasn't finished. "This case isn't just about my client, Your Honor. It's about a system that allows power and privilege to silence the truth. Officer Donnelly, the prosecution, this courtroom, they've all played a part in this injustice, and I intend to find out why." The judge's face turned pale, and Lisa knew Greg's words were cutting too close to the truth. For years, Judge Halliday had wielded his power to protect his family and his reputation. But now, with the eyes of the town on him, he couldn't hide any longer. Just as Greg finished his statement, the courtroom doors swung open. All heads turned as Camille Dawson, the journalist, walked in, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She held a manila folder in one hand, her expression cool and unflinching. "Your Honor," Camille said, her voice cutting through the tension, "I have information relevant to this case." Judge Halliday's jaw tightened. "This is highly irregular," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Camille stepped forward, handing the folder to the bailiff. Inside this folder are financial records, communications, and witness testimonies that point to a pattern of corruption involving the Halliday family. This includes evidence of Judge Halliday's direct involvement in tampering with cases to protect his son. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Reporters scribbled furiously, and spectators murmured in disbelief. Lisa felt her breath catch in her throat. She had suspected the Hallidays' corruption, but hearing it laid out so plainly still shook her. Judge Halliday's gavel pounded against his desk, but his voice cracked as he demanded order. "This is an outrage," he barked. "This court will not entertain baseless accusations." But Camille wasn't finished. "The evidence also includes records of payments made to Officer Donnelly, corroborating his role in destroying key evidence in this case. If you'd like, Your Honor, I can have my source testify in court." All eyes turned to the judge, whose face was ashen. The room was silent, waiting for his response. Lisa watched him closely, her heart racing. She could see the fear in his eyes, the weight of the walls closing in on him. Finally, Judge Halliday spoke, his voice hollow. "The court will recess for the day. I need time to review this so-called evidence." But it was too late. The damage had been done. As the judge stood to leave, Mike rose to his feet, locking eyes with him once again. This time, Mike didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The look on his face, calm, steady, and unbroken, said everything. The judge paused, his shoulders slumping under the weight of the moment. He turned and walked out of the courtroom, his steps unsteady, leaving behind a room buzzing with the realization that the truth had finally caught up to him. Lisa reached for Mike's hand, tears streaming down her face. "It's happening," she whispered. "They can't hide anymore." Mike nodded, his voice quiet but firm. "We're not done yet." The storm had arrived, and with it, the chance to finally break the system that had tried to destroy them. "I hereby declare the defendant, Michael Carter, not guilty." The words hung in the air, a hammer blow that shattered the weight of weeks of fear and tension. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Some cheering, others shouting in disbelief, but Mike barely heard them. All he could focus on was the judge, slumped in his chair, his gavel resting uselessly on the desk. For the first time in days, Mike felt like he could breathe. Lisa's tears came immediately, her body trembling as she pulled Mike into a tight embrace. Around them, reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing like bursts of lightning. Greg clapped Mike on the back, his grin wide with relief. "You did it, kid," he said. "No," Mike replied quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it." The verdict marked the end of the trial, but it wasn't the end of the story. The courtroom may have cleared, but the storm outside raged on. Protesters filled the streets of Stonebridge, their voices louder than ever. The footage and Camille's exposé had ignited a fire in the town, forcing people to confront the ugly truths they'd ignored for too long. Judge Halliday didn't return to the bench after the verdict. Within hours, he tendered his resignation, citing personal reasons. But everyone in Stonebridge knew the real reason. The evidence against him was damning. Camille's articles had exposed years of corruption, from bribery to judicial misconduct, and the public demanded justice. Officer Donnelly wasn't spared either. Camille's revelations tied him directly to the destruction of evidence, and he was placed on administrative leave pending a criminal investigation. His reputation, much like Judge Halliday's, was in ruins. But the fallout didn't stop there. The Halliday family, once untouchable, was now at the center of an FBI investigation. Camille's relentless reporting uncovered a network of corruption that stretched far beyond Stonebridge, implicating powerful allies who had shielded the Hallidays for years. The cracks in their empire had widened, and it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. For Lisa and Mike, the end of the trial brought a bittersweet sense of relief. The charges against Mike were dropped, and he was free to go home, but the scars of the ordeal lingered. Mike had spent weeks being vilified, treated as guilty before proven innocent. The experience had changed him, hardening him in ways Lisa wished it hadn't. "You okay, baby?" Lisa asked as they walked out of the courthouse, the cold winter air biting at their skin. Mike nodded but didn't speak. He looked out at the crowd of protesters, at the signs reading "Justice for Mike" and "End the Corruption," and felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. "They believe in you now," Lisa said softly, following his gaze. "They see what I've always seen." Mike turned to her, his expression serious. "They see what they want to see," he said. "But we both know they wouldn't have cared if we didn't have that footage. If we didn't fight like hell to prove the truth." Lisa's heart ached at his words, but she couldn't deny them. The system hadn't saved Mike. It had tried to destroy him. What saved him was their determination, their refusal to give up when the odds were stacked against them. In the weeks that followed, the protests in Stonebridge turned into a larger movement. People began demanding reforms in the justice system, calling for accountability from those in power. The trial had exposed deep cracks in the foundation of the town, and for the first time, the people of Stonebridge seemed ready to fix them. Camille's articles continued to shed light on the injustices that had plagued the town for decades. Her reporting earned her both praise and threats, but she refused to back down. She became a central figure in the movement, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. For Lisa and Mike, life slowly began to return to a new kind of normal. Mike went back to school, though he struggled to adjust. Some classmates treated him like a hero, while others avoided him entirely. The whispers hadn't stopped, but Mike had learned to block them out. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch of their small apartment, Lisa turned to Mike. "What now?" she asked. Mike shrugged, staring out at the horizon. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not going to let them win. Not ever again." Lisa smiled, her chest swelling with pride. "That's my boy," she said, wrapping her arm around him. Mike leaned into her, letting himself feel the comfort of her presence. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, There was still so much work to be done, so many battles left to fight, but for the first time in weeks he felt a flicker of hope. The truth had been revealed. The town had been shaken to its core. And though the scars of the ordeal would never fully fade, Mike and Lisa knew one thing for certain. They had stood against the system and survived. And in doing so, they had sparked something bigger than themselves. A fight for justice that would echo far beyond the walls of the courthouse, changing Stonebridge, and perhaps the world, forever.